Okay, so welcome to this video on the anatomy of a research paper. Now, as you probably noticed throughout your studies, most scientific articles follow a ridiculously simple structure. They start relatively broad and general. They tie their own research into a broader societal and academic context. Then they work their way down to a very detailed description of the inner workings of the current study in order to then move back up, broaden up again, and tie or embed their findings into the broader societal academic context. So this model is called the Hourglass model of an academic paper. As a rule of thumb, this model can be divided into 7 different sections. And in this video, I would like to walk through these sections step by step. So let's start with the introduction. As the name implies, an introduction introduces the reader to the larger societal and academic context in which we should situate our study. That also means that in our introduction, we need to give a rationale or a justification for our study. We need to make immediately clear why this study or this research report matters. Writing an introduction is a very difficult task. So I'm not going to go into that here in detail. But in a separate video, John Harbert gives an excellent explanation on how to write a good introduction. He gives some very concrete examples and gives some immediate pointers on how to write a good introduction. So definitely check that video out. So after we introduced our topic very generally, in a societal and academic context, we then move on to a more concrete section. Here, the literature review, we start to uncover bit by bit more information of our research topic. In our literature review, we really ask ourselves the question, what is already known about our research topic? What have previous authors written about this? And that also means that we can slowly start to identify the question, what still remains to be studied or what is still unknown? In the literature review, what we try to do is to really embed our research into a general academic conversation. So we show what other authors already did in this domain, and we try to be in dialogue with those authors. So our literature review is normally structured as if we're uncovering several specific theoretical concepts in our study. So this could be concept 1, concept 2, concept 3, and so on. What is very important in a literature study is that we try to synthesize previous works and not summarize them. So what I mean with that is that way too often in research papers, or more specifically in student papers, what we see is that a literature review is rather structured as if it was a summary. So author A said X, author B said Y, author C said, and so on. But we want to go beyond that. We want to really synthesize. We want to contrast what previous authors said. Why does author A differ in opinion from author B, or in findings? On what topics do previous authors converge or diverge? And so this is really important in a good literature review, is that we already start being a little bit more concrete about our study. In doing so, we expose the different theoretical concepts that we are going to work with. And in doing so also, we show the broader academic dialogue that we are part of with our study by synthesizing previous work. A next step still, so we started very broad in our introduction, then we went a little bit more concrete in our literature review, and now we get a little bit more concrete still, because we identified what was already known, what was not known yet, and that drove us to our own research question. So now in the current study section, we can introduce the reader to our research question. What do we want to know, and what are we going to contribute to this broader dialogue and to this broader societal and academic context? So in our current study, we introduce the reader to our research question, or maybe if we write a more deductive paper, we would introduce the reader to some concrete and testable hypotheses. In the next step, the methods section or the methodology, we are, as you can see, the most concrete or the most detailed in this whole hourglass model. In the methods section, we introduce the reader to three things specifically. We say how our data were gathered, we explain how our data were measured, and we tell the reader how our data were analyzed. Let's look at some examples here. So in our method section, we really tell the reader how we selected our participants. Why did we select those participants? So what were our inclusion criteria? What were our exclusion criteria? What sampling method did we use? Did we use a convenience sample or a representative sample? Or if generalizability was not our main aim, maybe we used a purposeful sample. Did we use snowball sampling, and how did we use this specific technique? Also, this is the place where we start describing our sample already a little bit. So we would give the reader an indication of the exact composition of our sample, and so we could give the key characteristics of our participants. What we also do in our method section is that we show what measurement instruments we used on our participants in order to measure those concepts that we identified earlier in the literature review, and how did we measure them. So in a quantitative survey, on a questionnaire, we would here introduce the reader to the different scales that we used in our survey, or whether they were validated or not. In an interview study, for example, we would then here include what topic list did we use, or what was the interview guide, consisting of which questions. In our method section, we also explicitly state how long the participation in our study took for the participants. Was it just filling out a questionnaire for 15 minutes, or was it an interview of almost 2 hours? We give an average of the time of participation. Also in our method section, we discuss how our data were analyzed. So in a quantitative study, for example, we would discuss that we chose a regression model, a linear regression model, and why. In our model, what were our independent variables, and which one was our dependent variable? In a qualitative study, we would explain here which analysis technique we used. Did we do a thematic analysis, or a narrative analysis, or a content analysis? And we embed this in function of our sample. And this description of our methods should be very, very precise and detailed. And this has a reason. The aim of a method section is replicability. What that means is that any other researcher should be able to take your study, read it, and on the basis of the information provided by us in the methodology section, the other author should be able to redo our study or reproduce it, or in other words, replicate it. This is all the idea of the method section. We are as transparent and detailed as possible in explaining what we did and how we did it. So replicability is a very important aim in order to, and that's the reason why we write this very detailed and is the most concrete part of our whole Hourglass model. After we described how we did it, we go to the results. Now the results section is actually a very dry section. All we do is presenting the readers with our findings. In doing so, we relate already back to our current study. So basically what we're doing in our results is answering our research question and confirming or not our hypotheses. So our results section is, was our research question answered? If so, how? What comes out of the data that we believe that this research question was answered? So what we do in this section really is describing. It's not yet interpreting. To give an example, if it was a quantitative study, we would then here, for example, say, well, our first hypothesis is confirmed. And here you see a table with our regression model. This was our dependent variable. These were our independent variables. And you see that variable x and y were indeed significant predictors for our dependent variable. So we confirm our first hypothesis. There's no interpretation yet there. There is no explication of why we found this and whether this finding was relates to previous authors. It's merely describing. In a qualitative study, this would also mean, for example, that we show the different themes that boiled up from the data. So we would say we found those themes out of our interviews, or these were the topics or concepts that we found during our observations. And instead of demonstrating our evidence with a table, in a qualitative study, we would include quotes from our participants, for example. So the results section is a very dry description, merely saying what we found, what our data is. And so that's still relatively detailed and relatively concrete on this study. In the next step, in the discussion, now we're moving a little bit broader again. So we're tying our data back into this previous academic conversation that we are part of. So the concepts and the literature that we introduced in the second section, the literature review, do now find their way into the discussion because we are going to interpret or to interpret our findings in this larger academic conversation. So, for example, if we look at the discussion or what we previously said, we found a specific correlation with our survey, then we would here start to interpret this finding and to what extent it converges or diverges with previous studies. Do we corroborate the theory that we described? Do we corroborate what previous authors found in a qualitative study, for example? Or is this something else? And how can we explain that? In a qualitative study, for example, we also here would then start to embed our research findings, our thematic results or our narrative. We would then try to link this back to previous studies within this domain and specifically, for example, a theoretical framework. So where in the results section we describe our data, nothing else than just presenting it there, dry, without interpreting, in our discussion we are interpreting and not describing anymore. So here in the discussion it shouldn't be just a replication or repeating ourselves from our results section. Here we should really try to broaden up again and try to embed our findings in this broader academic dialogue that we're part of. And in the last section, the conclusion section, we go very broad again and we try to embed our research, or we connect it again back to this larger societal and academic context that we discussed in the beginning. So as you remember, we also introduced here a rationale for our study, or why does our study matter? And that's also what we do again in our conclusion. In our conclusion also, we take a little bit a bird's eye perspective on our whole research study. As if we are an impartial spectator, we start reflecting on our study. So that also means that we start asking ourselves the question, where could we possibly be wrong? To what extent are the measurement instruments or the research tools that we used, to what extent are they limited? What are the limitations of doing, for example, a survey? What are the limitations of our sample? What were the limitations of my interviews? What we also do in the conclusion is giving implications. So this is again broadening up. Here we embed our research, or we translate our findings to educational practice, politics, policymakers, society, healthcare, clinical practice, name it, whatever your research topic is about. And so the broader implications are really in our conclusion. They haven't been discussed yet in the discussion, nor in the results section. They only come in our conclusion. And in the last section of our conclusion, we also acknowledge that our study is merely a small puzzle piece in a very large, endless maybe, puzzle. And in doing so, in acknowledging that we are just one part of it, we also can identify what future studies should do. If we did, for example, a large quantitative study and we found some patterns in our data, we could advise or encourage future studies to go in depth and to try to do qualitative studies in order to understand in a more detailed fashion our patterns. If we did a qualitative study, we could, in our conclusion, encourage future studies to do quantitative research on whether our detailed findings from our interviews also maybe hold water in a larger sample across society or across cultures, across countries. So that is a perfect way to conclude our research. Where could we possibly be wrong? But what does our study mean, or what do our data really mean to a broader societal and academic contexts? And what should future studies still do to uncover more of this research puzzle? Until so far, the hourglass model of a research paper. Now, in a separate video, I will dissect with you a paper that you read in the Good Life course. It's a paper by Professor Kathleen Gabriels, and a colleague on health trackers. I think it's an excellent example to show how this hourglass model was used in their study. So if you want to learn by dissecting this paper, please check this video out. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your studies and your project.